U.S. tolerance for some of the misconduct by the Israeli government and the Israeli military here is setting a precedent that is going to come back to bite us in a lot of other crisis zones well into the future.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. For humanitarian professionals, people whose job it is to deliver aid in conflicts and disaster zones, Gaza is unique. Unlike other crises that suffer from lack of attention, the situation in Gaza is a top priority for governments around the world. Accordingly, there is no shortage of aid available to stem the crisis, which in some parts of Gaza has crossed the threshold to famine. Rather, distributing that aid has become the challenge, both in terms of getting the aid through Israeli controls and inspections, and then, once in Gaza, getting the aid to where people need it most. My guest today, Jeremy Konyndyke, is the president of Refugees International and a veteran humanitarian professional who served as head of USAID's Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance from 2013 to 2017. We kick off discussing why humanitarian groups, the United Nations, and the Biden administration are so concerned about a full-scale Israeli assault on Rafah in southern Gaza. We then discuss the propriety of a humanitarian pier the U.S. has constructed off the coast of Gaza, and why this crisis in Gaza is just so different from other humanitarian crises around the world. We conclude our conversation with an important discussion of the crisis in Darfur and specifically the complicity of the United Arab Emirates in supporting a genocidal paramilitary. This conversation is full of expert insights from a veteran humanitarian affairs professional. I think you will learn a lot from it. I know I did. And of course, as always, please visit globaldispatches.org to get in touch with me. I love to hear from you. You can suggest to me topics that I ought to cover, people I should interview, or anything else that is on your mind. I respond to all my emails eventually, at least, and so please don't hesitate to reach out to me using the contact button on globaldispatches.org. And of course, as always, while you are there, I so appreciate those of you who have become paying supporters of the show. You help us keep the lights on around here. Thank you. Now here is my conversation with Jeremy Konyndyke, president of Refugees International. Jeremy, we are speaking at a time of an expanded military campaign in Rafah. The UN has been warning against this. Humanitarian agencies have been warning against this. The Biden administration has also been insisting that Israel not conduct a full-scale military operation in Rafah, whatever that means. Why is there such profound concern over this particular aspect of the Gaza conflict?
So there are several reasons why there is immense concern over really, I think, any degree of significant military operations in Rafah, but particularly the kind of full-scale ground invasion that the Biden administration has most strongly warned against. The first is that just simply this is where most of the population of Gaza has now been forced to shelter. They're doing so in extremely difficult and austere conditions, really sort of informal tent camp style conditions throughout much of Rafah and the surrounding area. So the population there really has very little protection and is extraordinarily vulnerable. And there's really nowhere else safe that they can go. The reason that they are in Rafah in the first place is because the IDF military campaign has destroyed much of the territory north of Rafah. The pictures of what's happened in Gaza City and parts of Khan Yunis and other major population centers north of Rafah are reminiscent of what Assad did in Aleppo or what Putin did to Grozny. I mean, it's just total block by block destruction of residential areas. And so people have fled that. And the conditions in Rafah are pretty terrible, but would be even worse in areas further north. The Israeli government has proposed that people should relocate to an area called Al Mawasi, which they are calling a safe zone. It's not particularly safe, but it's a very, very small area, about the size of Heathrow Airport along the coast, kind of northwest of Rafah. It's a smaller area. It's not developed. There are no services there. It's really not a viable place for people to relocate. So there's nowhere safe for people to go. And the rhetoric from the U.S. government has been that the Rafah operation should not go forward until there is a safe way to evacuate people. I and a lot of other humanitarian leaders have deep concern with that framing, because it presumes that there would be a safe way to evacuate people. And I don't think any humanitarian groups believe that to be the case. The second big concern is that most of the humanitarian operation in Gaza at this point runs through and out of Rafah.
And the area is also where there are two key crossings. They have the Kerem Shalom crossing and also the Rafah crossing. And my understanding is the Rafah crossing is now controlled by Israel on the Gaza side of the border, which adds further complications.
Yeah, and this is another reason why there is so much concern about a full-scale Rafah offensive. Virtually all of the international humanitarian aid that has entered Gaza since the start of the war has gone through the Rafah or Kerem Shalom crossings. And as of about 10 days ago, when a new wave of Israeli military activity started in and around Rafah, the Rafah crossing was shut down. Kerem Shalom was shut down completely for several days, and now there is a kind of dispute between the UN and Israel about whether it is in fact open. The Israeli government claims it is. The UN has been saying that they're still not able to move things through there. And it's been hugely disruptive. So fuel stopped entering for several days and began grinding the entire humanitarian operation to a halt. There was at least one day where fuel entered in the past few days, but still not nearly the level that's needed to sustain even the kind of minimal humanitarian operations that were going on before. And I was talking to several NGO colleagues yesterday, one of whom said, one of the larger international NGOs operating in Gaza said that their operations were now basically at a standstill because they did not have the fuel to operate. And I think that is just a small preview of what the disruption of a full-scale military operation would look like. And that is hugely worrying, because a major reason why the South has not reached the degree of famine conditions that we're seeing in northern Gaza is that humanitarian aid operation. There's been very little and very inconsistent humanitarian access to northern Gaza because it is being blocked by the Israeli military. But in the south, and particularly in and around Rafah, where the bulk of the population now are, the access has been, I would say, still poor, but better than the access in the north. And so if there is a full-scale military operation, and given what we've seen over the last week and a half by the extreme disruption, even by these more so-called modest military operations by the IDF, if there were a larger scale military operation in Rafah, it would basically collapse the humanitarian presence in Rafah and, by extension, collapse the humanitarian effort across most of, if not all of, the territory. That would likely mean the famine would not just be in the north, it would spread to the south as well.
I'm glad you brought up the situation in the north, because we're recording this on Thursday, May 16th. Earlier today, the United States finalized this floating humanitarian pier it had constructed off the coast of Gaza. And if all goes according to plan, aid will soon be distributed from this maritime route connecting supplies in Cyprus to Gaza via this pier. Now, I have my own thoughts on the wisdom and propriety of this. In my newsletter, I describe this as a solution to a problem that does not exist. The challenge of getting aid to Gaza is not a logistical one, it's a political one. But I'm curious to learn your thoughts on this project and its intended impact, particularly in the context of a shuttering of aid through those crossings in Rafah.
I thought your characterization of this as a solution to the wrong problem was absolutely right. Another great way of putting it, which I'll credit to my colleague Jada McKenna, the CEO of Mercy Corps, is that it's humanitarian theater.
I called it performative humanitarianism.
It's all of those things. It is creating the appearance of addressing a problem, but the problem is not, in fact, the salient problem. So, in theory, what the pier achieves is it enables a way to get more volume of aid over the border and onto the territory of Gaza. What it does not fix is the last mile distribution situation. And it is the last mile distribution within Gaza that is by far the biggest problem today. The problem has not been just the small volume coming across the border. The problem has been what happens when something gets over the line and is in Gaza. And once a truckload of aid gets into Gaza, and that's quite a saga in and of itself, but once it gets over the line into Gaza, for organizations to move it, they need security and the ability to operate safely in Gaza. They don't have that. They need access to trucks. There are not nearly enough trucks inside Gaza. They need permissions from the IDF to move. That is very, very difficult to obtain. And then once they have permissions to move, they also need to have some assurance of deconfliction so they can actually do that movement safely.
And deconfliction is the idea in humanitarianism that groups that want to distribute aid need to speak to armed groups in order to ensure that they are not attacked in the process of distributing this aid. And one of the key challenges thus far is there is no credible deconfliction mechanism in Gaza right now.
That's right. Deconfliction is basically aid groups saying, hey, we're humanitarians, we're going to be here, please don't bomb us.
And it was the breakdown or the non-existence of this deconfliction mechanism that led to the World Central Kitchen tragedy in April.
I wouldn't say a breakdown. I would say the complete absence of any real meaningful deconfliction process. It wasn't like there was a working system that just failed that one time. It is a system that's been absent. And humanitarians have been screaming since last fall about this concern. Before the World Central Kitchen strike, almost 200 Palestinians had been killed. Palestinian employees of humanitarian agencies had been killed by Israeli military action, many of them in facilities that had been nominally deconflicted or on routes, moving along routes that had nominally been deconflicted. I think one example that has really stuck with me, there was this young girl, Hind, who was evacuating in northern Gaza, I think outside Gaza City, evacuating with her family after her family received an IDF evacuation order. So they were trying to comply with an IDF evacuation order. In the process of complying with that order and moving to the designated area, they were then targeted by other forces of the IDF. Their car was blown up. She survived. She had a phone. She tried to call the equivalent of 911. The Palestinian Red Crescent received the call, and the audio has been widely shared. They then dispatched a team from the Palestinian Red Crescent, a team of paramedics. They were given a route to move along by the IDF. They too were targeted. Their car was blown up. They all died. So, here you have two carloads of civilians trying to comply with IDF orders that are nominally for their own safety. And in both cases, that led directly to their deaths. That's not a situation where something like the World Central Kitchen strike is an aberration in an otherwise functional system. I think the World Central Kitchen strike is the inevitable culmination of practices we'd seen by the IDF since the beginning of the war.
So, when I first reached out to you for an interview a couple of weeks ago, it seemed that we were as close as we have been to some sort of ceasefire agreement. Those talks broke down. It really does not look like there is a ceasefire agreement to be reached anytime in the near future. So in the absence of a ceasefire or some sort of cessation of hostilities, is there anything that can be done to increase humanitarian access and mitigate the consequences to civilians from this conflict? Or really are all the eggs in like the ceasefire basket?
I'd answer that two ways. Is there a hypothetical world in which that would be possible while the war continues? Yeah, there is a hypothetical world where that could be possible. And it's a world in which the IDF takes seriously its obligations under international humanitarian law. Sadly, that is not the world that we're in. And I think this is why, from early on, humanitarian groups have been calling for a ceasefire, because what we've seen in the actual conduct of the IDF and how they fought this war is that they're not adhering to IHL, that they are committing violations of that and violations amounting to war crimes and, in my view, crimes against humanity routinely. And that is the reality. So there's an alternative timeline here. There's an alternative somewhere in a parallel part of the multiverse. There is a version of this war where the IDF is being scrupulous about civilian protection, is being scrupulous about protecting humanitarians, and rather than picking fights with the UN system, is trying to work with the UN system to truly preserve and protect the well-being of 2 million civilians in Gaza. That is not clearly the world we're in. And, it's not impossible. It's something that could be done, and it's something that could be done in an urban environment if there were a sincere will to do it, but there's not. So we have to deal with the world that we're in. We have to deal with the conduct of the IDF that we actually see. And this is something that it's a disconnect that I see actually in a lot of the defense of the war and defense of continued support for the war by the US government and by some of the pundits and commentators who speak out on the war is, they're defending a version of the war that does not exist on the ground. They're defending a version of the war in which Israel is complying, in which Israeli assurances of adherence to IHL are credible. That's not the world we're in. And I think the reason that the World Central Kitchen strike was so jarring and got so much attention was because it punctured that imaginary world in a way that was harder to ignore. It was easier to ignore the reality of that conduct when it was only, and this is not my view, but in reflecting the view that I think prevails, when it was only Palestinian aid workers who were being killed, it was easier to ignore. When it is Western aid workers being killed by a very prominent, very politically connected humanitarian organization, that's harder to disregard. And that's why that became such a political moment. But it's part and parcel of conduct that we've seen from the IDF throughout. So I think going forward, if there were a world where the IDF could totally overhaul the conduct of its soldiers, totally overhaul its rules of engagement, totally overhaul its systems and mechanisms for deconfliction and coordination with humanitarian actors, is there a version of the war where that could reconcile both a full-scale humanitarian operation with the continuation of hostilities? Maybe. That's not the world that we see in front of us in Gaza. And that's why we have to deal with the reality we see. And just purely as a matter of operational reality, leaving aside the politics of it, as a matter of operational reality, it will not be possible to meaningfully contain and reverse famine in Gaza without an enduring ceasefire.
So one of the reasons I wanted to speak to you specifically is that in addition to having a long career in the NGO sector, you are also the senior official at USAID in charge of implementing foreign disaster assistance. You are the guy in the U.S. government in charge of getting humanitarian aid to disaster zones. I'm curious to learn from you, how different, if at all, is the U.S. approach to getting aid to Gaza from any other crisis that you had worked on during your time in government around the world?
It's very different, and there are a couple of analogs that I would point to. And I think one of the larger concerns that I have here is that U.S. tolerance for some of the misconduct by the Israeli government and the Israeli military here is setting a precedent that is going to come back to bite us in a lot of other crisis zones well into the future. A couple examples of that. One of the big fights on Gaza has been over Israeli inspection. That the Israeli government has insisted that they inspect every inch of every truckload of humanitarian aid that goes into Gaza. And they then do that in a way that is very arbitrary. They routinely will reject entire truckloads over a single item. There's no consistency to how they do that. So the individual soldier who happens to be manning the inspection that day has immense discretion over what they reject, and very little accountability for how they exercise that. And it's created this Kafkaesque world for NGOs where they don't have any explicit list of things they can't bring in. And they have been trying to get this from the Israeli government for months. What is the list of things we cannot bring in? There is no definitive list. It's up to the judgment of the soldiers who are manning the inspection checkpoints. And of course, Israel is a belligerent in this war. And so the objection from humanitarians has been, there is nowhere else on earth where we would accept that one belligerent party in a conflict gets veto power over what constitutes humanitarian aid for that population. And just to give one example of how capricious and wrongheaded this is, there are huge problems with clean water availability in Gaza. The water system is shattered. The Israeli government, as part of their collective punishment tactics, shut off much of the water inflow that went to Gaza because much of that was controlled through Israeli territory. They've turned that off. And so what we would normally do as humanitarians in that kind of a situation where the system water is broken is provide means for people to purify water at a household level. And you do that in a very simple way with a bucket and with chlorine tabs to purify the water so that it is safe to consume. Chlorine tabs are not allowed to go in because chlorine is considered a dual-use substance by the IDF. And so, this very standard humanitarian tool cannot go in. Now zoom over to Syria. One of the big fights in Syria with the Syrian regime for years has been their view that they should have the same right. They should have the right to inspect any aid that humanitarian groups bring into northern Syria. And the U.S., to its credit, has held the line on that and has really fought hard with Russia and the Security Council over the years to hold the line on that, because there's no just world in which the Syrian regime should be allowed to inspect the aid that is going into areas outside of its control. And I don't know how going forward in that kind of a setting, the U.S. can credibly maintain in a way that Russia and China will buy that the Syrian government should not have the same right to inspect and reject that the Israeli government has. When you have a principle that rests on something universal, which is that belligerent parties to a conflict should not have veto power over what goes to their enemies, that's a principle you can apply. That's now gone, because now the principle is, well, we like Israel and we don't like Syria. But that only holds if, in fact, you like Israel and you don't like Syria. And of course, that's not the case for Russia and China. So, that explodes that precedent. Another example of this is in Yemen with the Saudis in 2015. One of the things that I worked on when I was at USAID, we had a similar problem with the Saudis where they were imposing a naval blockade on the parts of Yemen that were under Houthi control. And it was a collective punishment tactic. They were frankly pretty open about that. But their stated rationale was, well, we just need to make sure that Iran is not shipping weapons in. So therefore, we have to hold and inspect every individual ship that goes into Houthi territory to make sure it is not a front for Iranian weapons. And of course, then they were using that as a way to greatly restrict anything from going into those areas, including, in particular, fuel. So what we orchestrated, and the U.S. government really drove this in partnership with the UN to kind of call the Saudis bluff on this, what we orchestrated was something called the UN Verification and Inspection Mechanism, which took the inspection responsibility away from the Saudis as a belligerent party to the conflict, again, took that away and handed it over to the UN as an impartial actor. And then if the Saudis had a specific intelligence concern about a particular vessel, they could relay that to the UN. The UN would carry out the inspection of those vessels in a way that was recognized as good faith by all sides, and the aid could flow. And so these precedents that the U.S. has not just supported, but actively created for Yemen and for Syria are being shredded by U.S. conduct towards the Israeli government right now.
And that might have really detrimental consequences down the road. So I also wanted to ask you about the humanitarian crisis in Sudan, and specifically in Darfur in Western Sudan. The situation there and in Gaza bears some similarity because in both cases, key external players are important U.S. security partners, Israel and Gaza, and the UAE in Sudan. The UAE is the main backer of the genocidal rapid support forces. We've done lots of episodes on that. Why has it been so difficult for the U.S. to work with the UAE or impress upon the UAE the need to put the brakes on its support for the RSF and increase humanitarian access to Darfur?
Obviously, I don't have full visibility on everything that might be said to them behind the scenes. But what has been really striking is how reticent the U.S. government has been to even publicly acknowledge the role that UAE is playing in violating the arms embargo on Darfur and directly arming the RSF forces, which, as you rightly say, are genocidal, both in the sense that they are the descendants of the Janjaweed that carried out the genocide 20 years ago, and in the sense that much of their conduct today appears to amount to acts of genocide. And that's all being directly equipped. It's a little bit like, if you've been handing out machetes to the Interahamwe in the midst of the Rwandan genocide. I mean, like, they are being actively armed and equipped by the UAE. And apart from a comment by Ambassador Thomas Greenfield in the Security Council last week, which I was glad to see, if a bit belatedly, the U.S. really has not publicly acknowledged what UAE is doing.
Yeah, they've been biting their tongue.
It's quite staggering. And this is not a factual controversy. The UAE has denied it, but it has been reported very credibly and documented very extensively by multiple media outlets and by the UN panel of experts on Sudan. That is a threshold of evidence that normally, if we were talking about Russia, the U.S. would not be holding back. And I think there is a degree of deference that the UAE is getting from the U.S. government over this because they want to work with UAE on other things. They're working with UAE on countering Iran. They're working with UAE and trying to partner with UAE diplomatically on the Abraham Accords, and they want UAE to recognize Israel in that process. And so, almost giving them a pass publicly on what UAE is doing in Darfur. And in my view, it's just really, really indefensible. What makes it even more grotesque is that the way that UAE is doing this is under cover of what they're characterizing as a humanitarian operation. So when they have been challenged about why are you flying plane load after 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 plane load into Amjaras in northern Chad, their argument is, well, we've set up a humanitarian field hospital there for refugees from Darfur, and we're doing aid projects there. Now, Amjaras is nowhere near the main refugee centers in eastern Chad, which are much further south. There's been no significant refugee population there, and certainly was no significant refugee population there when they established the field hospital. And when you actually go in and look at what they claim to be doing, and which we've done some open source reviewing on this, it looks a lot like a kind of AstroTurf strategic communications operation intended to create the impression that they are doing a lot of humanitarian activity. So there are many, many press releases by UAE media outlets talking about the work of the Emirates Red Crescent in and around Amjaras, but describing very, very small ball sort of humanitarian aid distributions, like we went to this village and gave a few food parcels, nowhere near the kind of volume of what they're bringing in. And so, what they are doing is using this humanitarian operation as cover for arming a genocidal militia in direct violation of an arms embargo, and doing so with, it has to be said, the complicity of the Emirates Red Crescent. And it's hard to imagine the Emirates Red Crescent does not understand or know what's going on with this. We have raised this with the Red Cross Red Crescent Federation in Geneva. I've discussed it with them several times. My understanding is they have triggered an investigation of the Emirates Red Crescent over this. I don't know what the outcome of that was. But in our view, this is a direct violation of the principles of the Red Cross Red Crescent movement and should lead to the suspension of the Emirates Red Crescent. I'll leave it there.
Ooh, that's a bombshell. You're leaving it there. That's fascinating. And will we know if and when this review has been completed?
I don't know. I hope so. But anybody can do the research we did. It's scrubbing a lot of UAE communications releases that are available online, and judge for yourselves if the level of activity that is depicted in those releases seems at all commensurate to the volume of air cargo that UAE has been shipping in. And if the idea of setting up a field hospital for refugees that is a huge distance in a huge country away from where the refugees are actually living seems like a plausible place to set up such an operation.
Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.